In this video, we're going to be talking about ACL rehab for field hockey players. Now, ACL injuries are some of the most common and devastating injuries in sports, and for female hockey players, the risk is even higher. In today's video, we're going to explore comprehensive return to sport protocols for female athletes recovering from ACL reconstruction with a focus on field hockey. Now, field hockey is a fast-paced, demanding sport that requires players to sprint, to pivot, change direction rapidly, often in low positions. And unfortunately, these rapid movements and unplanned changes of direction can place high stress on the knee joint, particularly the ACL, and particularly when the surface is not that great as well, perhaps during the winter season when the surface is more slippy. Now, research shows that female field hockey athletes are at a significant risk of non-contact ACL, especially during competition. So during games, the risk is higher. And in fact, college-level field hockey players are at the highest risk of first-time ACL tears. Now, the rate of ACL injuries in women's field hockey is comparable to other sports like soccer, and a 10-year study found that ACL tears occur at a rate of about 21 per 10,000 athletic exposures, which is similar to other multi-directional sports. Now, rehab from an ACL tear follows a phased approach designed to ensure that athletes can regain strength, regain neuromuscular control, and recover their endurance to be able to perform on the pitch to meet the demands of the sport. Cotter's protocol from 2022 outlines 5 key phases with a particular focus on late phase rehab specific to field hockey and how we can make this as relevant to the sport as possible rather than following generic guidelines or making things non-specific. The risk of making things non-specific, of course, is that if we're basing it off a different sport and trying to prepare for different athletic demands, it's going to be very, very difficult to actually meet the needs of the sport and be fully prepared to reduce the risk of injury. And what we know from the research, again, is that the risk of re-injury can be as high as 40 or 50% if a proper protocol is not followed. This is the absolutely essential part of why we should be following a 5-phase approach and protocol to make sure that the athlete is fully prepared to go back to the sport. So let's break down each phase briefly. Phase 1, that's protection and mobility. This is focusing on the knee itself, managing pain and inflammation in the post-op phase and trying to restore basic mobility, so getting full range of motion back. Athletes are typically here trying to improve quadricep strength and full mobility, and the 2 key aims really here are about getting full extension and full knee flexion, typically trying to get at least 0 degrees of extension, ideally -5. That means getting into a slight bit of hyperextension and at least 120 degrees of knee flexion as well on the affected side. We can make sure we're measuring this on a consistent basis, and this can be measured both actively and passively. But primarily it's about making sure we've got full range of motion before we then move on to loading the knee up. And if we do miss this stage and we don't make sure we've got these ranges of motion in place, then there are further complications down the line. And reduced knee extension, for example, is associated with reduced quadricep activation and increased knee pain, which obviously is not what we want, and it's going to prolong that initial phase. So making sure this is the priority early on is super, super important. And this usually lasts for around 6 to 8 weeks as we're trying to really get that full knee flexion extension. But obviously it can take longer and it's very, very individual. Simple exercises like quad sets, hamstring flexions, assisted knee range of motion exercises, and using things like electroactivation exercises, using things like a complex to ensure we can get more quadricep activation is a really, really good way of doing this. And also fatiguing the hamstring with some basic kind of bridging based exercises before then going into doing quadricep activation can be really good, because obviously the 2 muscles work in partnership, and if the hamstring's a little bit fatigued, it's going to mean that you can actually fire up that quadricep a little bit more, which can be a really effective way of achieving this. Now in phase 2, the strengthening component, usually leading up to about week 8 to 12, we're focusing on strengthening the lower body, particularly the quadriceps, hamstrings, massively important, and the glutes and calves. Now, athletes are going to progress through this phase using exercises like squats and lunges, and also going to be working on balance and proprioception, which are also critical. And this phase is preparing for a return to running. And once you can achieve certain components like maximal strength scores, making sure you've got capacity of the lower body, so things like a certain number of calf raises, usually in the 20 to 25 rep category, single leg strength, like through a single leg squat, enough bridges, and also then single leg strength in something like a leg press. If all of that's in place, you can be fairly confident you're in a position then that the lower limb is prepared for the demands of running on the body, and we can start to introduce linear running. So in phase 3, that is plyometrics and neuromuscular control. This is where we can start to introduce plyometric drills, single leg hop based movements, and landing drills as well. Starting usually about the 3-month mark, but this can be completely individual. It sometimes can take longer than this, so just make sure you're doing it properly, and that's the importance again of following the criteria. So basically what we're going to start to do is introduce some plyometric training. These are crucial really for developing power, control, rate of force development, and landing mechanics, which helps to reduce the risk of re-injury when you're returning to sport. Single and double leg jumps are key in order to train the muscle groups that are going to be in demand when you're playing in hockey. If you think about it, we're going to be doing a lot of single leg work, multiple directional changes, decelerations, and unplanned change of direction as well. So making sure that the lower body is prepared for those demands is massively, massively important. And this is where we can also introduce linear running, because we've got the strength to achieve that now. In phase 4, that's cutting and pivoting. We're now looking at sport-specific training. So we're going to try to incorporate elements that make it more relevant to get to the demands of the game. Now, if you've got a counter-attack, for example, you've got to do a 180 turn and sprint. Well, we need to be able to complete that movement before putting it into a sport-specific environment where we're doing 3v3, 4v4, full gameplay. So making sure that we can achieve, change of direction both laterally, in a linear fashion, a full 180 turn is essential, and they need to be relevant to the demands of the game essentially. So think about what kind of demands are you going to be going through, what does that look like on the pitch, and how can you make it relevant therefore to the drills that you're going through. Finally then, once we've gone through all of that and we have gone through phase 1, we've got full range of motion, we've gone through phase 2, got full strength, we've gone through phase 3, we've incorporated linear running, we've gone through phase 4, cutting and pivoting and adding in more intensive plyometrics. We get to phase 5, and that's obviously returning to hockey, which is the exciting part. Now this is fully integrating the athlete back to the sport, so it's high intensity interval training, it's sport specific drills, it's full practice sessions, and athletes have got to meet the specific strength, agility and psychological readiness scores to then return to the sport. So it's a gradual reintroduction to sport specific practices, sport specific drills, and making sure that you're then able to complete a full training week without any issues at all, so without any flare-ups, without any issues that can stem from the knee, and that you're basically prepared and confident to go back. And then the most important thing really at this stage is that psychologically you feel ready to go back, and we assess that through something like an ACL RSI questionnaire, or something like the Tampa sort of measure of kinesiophobia, which in other words, how confident do you feel in the knee, and are you kind of slightly worried about going back and therefore hurting your knee. The more concerned you are about hurting your knee, the less confident you feel, the more likely you are to get injured again. So you've got to be super, super confident and pass those psychological readiness scores as well. So you're physically ready, you're also psychologically ready, you're excited about getting back, you've met all of those criteria, you're then in a great position to get back to hockey. Hope that's been useful and a good sort of overview of that 5-step process. And if you're interested, this is what I specialise in, so drop me a message and we can have a conversation about how I might be able to help you work through this process in my coaching program.